The difference between a sharper mind and an average one isn't how much information you can store. It's what your brain does with information when nobody is telling you what to think. If you want to improve your cognitive skills, think more clearly, learn from experience faster, and make better decisions in everyday life, this video is about the mental skills that actually can help. These aren't memory tricks or generic productivity habits. They're ways of processing information that can change how you approach a conversation, a problem, a new idea, or an important decision. And the first one is surprisingly simple. 1. Make predictions before you get the answer. Most of us consume information passively. We read an article, watch a video, hear someone's opinion, and then decide whether we agree. Try reversing that. Before you open the article, ask yourself, what do I think the answer is? Before you hear the explanation, make a guess. Before you see the result of an experiment, predict what will happen. This creates something called a prediction error, the gap between what your brain expected and what actually happened. Research suggests these mismatches can influence how strongly information is encoded into memory. And there's a useful twist here. You don't have to be right. In fact, being wrong can be extremely informative, because now your brain has something concrete to update. Suppose you're reading about why a company suddenly lost customers. Don't immediately read the explanation. First, write down your best guess. Then, compare it with reality. You're no longer just receiving information. You're testing a model of the world. A simple way to practice this is with index cards. On one side, write a question. On the other, write your answer. But before flipping the card, actually commit to an answer. The cards don't make you smarter. The act of predicting does. And that leads to the second skill, because a sharp thinker doesn't just ask for more information. They know how to ask for the right information. 2. Ask questions that change the problem. A surprisingly powerful cognitive skill is knowing how to change the question. Imagine you're struggling with, how do I find more time? That's one problem. Now change it to, what could I stop doing? Completely different problem. Or instead of asking, how do I get everyone to agree with this idea? Ask, what would make this idea easier to disagree with? You're deliberately changing the frame. One of my favorite versions is, what would have to be true for this to work? If you're considering taking a new job, starting a business, moving to another city, or changing your routine, this question forces you to identify assumptions. Maybe you believe you'll have more freedom. Okay, what would have to be true for that to actually happen? Maybe you believe the new job will pay enough to justify the commute. What would have to be true? This turns vague optimism into testable conditions. And when you can turn a vague problem into a set of conditions, your brain has something much more useful to work with. 3. Compress information instead of collecting it. A sharp mind isn't necessarily the mind that remembers the most details. It's often the mind that can compress a complicated idea without destroying what matters. Think about a doctor explaining a diagnosis, a manager explaining a business problem, or a friend explaining an argument. They may give you 20 pieces of information. Your job is to eventually ask, what's the simplest, accurate version of this? Not the shortest version, the simplest, accurate version. That's an important distinction. Try this after reading something substantial. Close the book, article, or video, and explain the idea in one sentence. Then ask, what are the 3 things that make that sentence true? You're building a hierarchy instead of a pile of facts. This is also why writing can be so useful. A notebook isn't just a place to store information. It's a place to reduce information into a model you can actually use. A reusable notebook can be useful here because you can repeatedly sketch explanations, rewrite them, and keep the versions you actually want. And there's an interesting benefit to doing this by hand. When you struggle to explain something simply, you've just discovered a gap in your understanding. Which brings us to a skill that can make learning much more efficient. 4. Compare similar things instead of studying them separately. Here's something people often get wrong about learning. If you're trying to understand two similar concepts, studying them completely separately can make them blur together. Instead, put them next to each other. Compare them. What's the same? What's different? When does one apply but not the other? This is related to interleaving, a learning strategy where different categories or problem types are mixed rather than practiced in isolated blocks. Research has found that interleaving can improve discrimination and generalization, especially when the things you're learning are easy to confuse. Imagine you're learning about investing. Don't learn stocks on Monday, bonds on Tuesday, and real estate on Wednesday as completely separate worlds. Ask, what problem does each solve? Where do they behave differently? What would make one attractive and another unattractive? You're training your brain to notice boundaries, not just definitions. This is useful far beyond school. Compare two job offers, compare two diets, compare two business strategies, compare two explanations for the same event. The question isn't simply, which one is better? It's, what distinction would make one better than the other? That is a much sharper question. 5. Practice seeing the same situation from a different position. Here's a skill that becomes incredibly valuable once you notice it. When something happens, we naturally experience it from our own position. But your first interpretation isn't the only possible interpretation. Imagine your manager sends you a short message. Can you call me when you have a minute? Your brain might instantly create a story. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe they're unhappy. Maybe there's a problem. But try switching perspectives. How would this message look if you were the manager? How would it look to a coworker who knows nothing about the situation? How would it look if you removed the emotional meaning you attached to it? This isn't about pretending everyone else is right. It's about separating what happened from the meaning your brain assigned to what happened. Perspective taking is a real cognitive process involving reasoning about other people's beliefs, intentions, and viewpoints. You can practice it with almost anything. When you disagree with someone, don't just prepare your rebuttal. Try to state their position in a way they would recognize as fair. If you can't do that, you probably don't understand the position yet. And that leads to one of the most underused thinking skills of all. 6. Look for solutions in completely different fields. When you're stuck on a problem, your brain tends to search for solutions that look like the problem. That's understandable. But some of the best solutions come from problems that don't look similar on the surface. A restaurant can borrow ideas from an airport. A teacher can borrow ideas from video games. A manager can borrow ideas from sports coaching. A writer can borrow ideas from engineering. This is called analogical thinking, recognizing that two situations may share the same underlying structure, even when their surface details are completely different. Research on analogical problem solving shows that successful transfer depends heavily on recognizing those deeper structural similarities, not just superficial resemblance. So when you're stuck, ask, where else does this same type of problem exist? Not the same industry, the same structure. If your problem is, how do I get people to consistently do something they keep forgetting? That's not only a workplace problem. That's a problem solved by checklists, aviation, medicine, software design, sports training, and even restaurant kitchens. Once you start looking for solutions across domains, your experience becomes a library of reusable patterns. 7. Think in probabilities instead of certainties. Here's one of the easiest ways to improve the quality of your thinking. Stop forcing every belief into true or false. Real life rarely works that cleanly. Instead, ask, how confident am I? Maybe you're 60% confident that a project will succeed. Maybe 80% confident your interpretation of an argument is correct. Maybe only 40% confident that the decision you're considering is the right one. That number isn't magic. The point is to make your uncertainty visible, because there's a huge difference between saying, I'm right, And I'm about 70% confident, but here's what could change my mind. That second statement is much easier to update. Metacognitive research has repeatedly shown that people aren't always well calibrated between how confident they feel and how accurate they actually are. In one applied study, novice decision makers showed substantially higher confidence than accuracy in their responses. You can train this with a simple notebook. Write, prediction, I think X will happen. Confidence, 70%. Then come back later and see what happened. Don't judge yourself, calibrate yourself. Over time, you start learning something incredibly valuable. What your own confidence feels like when you're actually right. 8. Think one step beyond the immediate result. Most decisions stop at the first consequence. You choose something because of what happens next. Sharper thinking asks, and then what? Suppose you decide to take on extra work because it pays more. First-order thinking says, more work leads to more money. Second-order thinking asks, more work, less free time, less recovery, potentially lower performance, to maybe the extra money isn't worth the trade-off. Neither conclusion is automatically correct. The point is to see the chain. This is especially useful with purchases, career decisions, business choices, and habits. Before acting, ask, what happens next? Then, what happens after that? You don't need to predict the entire future. Usually 2 or 3 steps is enough to reveal consequences that were invisible at first glance. A whiteboard is surprisingly useful for this. Put the decision in the center and draw arrows outward. Decision to immediate effect, to second effect, to possible trade-off. And once you start thinking in chains, there's another question worth adding. 9. Install a pause rule for your own biases. You don't need to eliminate cognitive biases. That's unrealistic. A more useful strategy is to create rules that catch predictable mistakes before they happen. This is called a cognitive forcing strategy. For example, before making an expensive purchase, wait 24 hours. Before sending an angry message, reread it tomorrow. Before hiring someone, write down your criteria before meeting the candidate. Before agreeing with a claim because you already like the person saying it, ask, what evidence would I accept if someone I disliked said the same thing? You're not trusting yourself less. You're designing a checkpoint for the situations where you know your judgment is vulnerable. Cognitive forcing strategies have been studied as ways to interrupt predictable reasoning errors, particularly in high-stakes decision-making. The important part is that the rule must be created before you're emotional, rushed, excited, or committed. That's when your rational brain is writing instructions for your future self. 10. Use counterfactual thinking as a learning tool. You probably already use counterfactual thinking. It's the, what if I had done this instead kind of thinking. But there's a much more useful way to use it. Don't use counterfactuals to replay things endlessly. Use them to identify leverage points. Suppose a presentation went badly. Instead of, I should have been more confident, ask, if I could change only one thing about the preparation, what would most likely change the outcome? Maybe it wasn't confidence. Maybe you didn't understand the audience. Maybe the first 5 minutes were unclear. Maybe you answered the wrong question. Counterfactual reasoning allows us to mentally construct alternatives to reality and compare them with what actually happened. Research connects it with learning, planning, causal reasoning, and decision-making, but it can also become unproductive if it's detached from actionable causes. So use one rule. Change one variable at a time. Ask, what is the smallest change that could have produced a meaningfully different result? That's much more useful than simply wishing the past had been different. 11. Keep an error log, not just a to-do list. Most people keep records of what they need to do. Very few keep records of where their thinking was wrong. That's a missed opportunity. You don't need a complicated journal. Once a week, write down 3 things. What did I expect? What actually happened? Why was there a difference? Maybe you thought a project would take 2 days and it took 5. Maybe you thought someone would respond positively and they didn't. Maybe you expected a purchase to solve a problem and it didn't. Maybe you were convinced something wouldn't matter and it did. This creates a feedback loop between your beliefs and reality. And it pairs beautifully with the prediction skill we started with. You make predictions. Reality gives you feedback. You record the gap. Then you adjust your mental model. A simple Rocketbook or ordinary notebook works perfectly for this. You don't need an elaborate productivity system. The value comes from seeing your own predictions over time, not from the notebook itself. And if you really want to make this powerful, don't only record mistakes. Record surprising successes too. You are trying to discover where your mental model is systematically wrong in either direction. 12. Build mental maps, not just mental lists. The final skill ties everything together. When you learn something important, don't leave it as a list of facts. Connect it. Ask, what causes what? What influences what? What is an example? What is the opposite? Where else could this idea apply? That turns information into a network. This is why concept mapping can be so useful. Research has found concept maps can support knowledge integration and critical thinking, particularly when they're used to connect ideas rather than simply decorate notes. You can do this on a whiteboard, a sheet of paper, or a tablet. Put the central idea in the middle, then draw the relationships. For example, if you're trying to understand why a business is losing customers, don't just write customers are leaving. Draw price to perceived value, to competition, to customer experience, to retention. Then ask which relationships you actually have evidence for. That's the difference between knowing information and understanding a system. And there's one final thing I want you to notice about all 12 skills. The real secret to becoming mentally sharper. None of these skills require you to become a completely different person. They change what you do at the moment information enters your mind. Before you receive an answer, predict. Before you accept a question, reframe it. Before you collect more information, compress what you already know. Before studying similar things separately, compare them. Before assuming your interpretation is correct, change perspectives. Before searching for a solution, look in another field. Before saying you're certain, estimate your confidence. Before making a decision, ask what happens next. Before trusting your judgment, install a pause rule. After something happens, ask what could have been different. After making a prediction, check it against reality. And when you learn something important, connect it to everything else you already understand. That's what makes these cognitive skills useful. You're not trying to fill your brain with more information. You're making the information already inside it more useful. And if you want to practice just one of these today, start with the first one. Before you look something up, before you ask someone, before you open the next video, make your own prediction first, then see what reality teaches you. That tiny pause can turn passive consumption into active thinking. And over time, those little moments are what build a sharper mind and ultimately a smarter life. If you genuinely found this useful, like the video and subscribe to Simple Ways of Life. We make these videos to give you practical ideas you can actually use, not just information that sounds good for 5 minutes. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep it simple.